Level 1. The Antikythera Mechanism. Off the southern coast of Greece, in waters about 60 meters deep, the wreck sat untouched for roughly 2,000 years before sponge divers stumbled across it in the spring of 1900. Among amphorae, marble statues, and corroded bronze, there was something that looked like a rock. Archaeologist Valerio Stais noticed, in 1902, that the rock had a gear wheel embedded in it. Nobody took him seriously. The scientific consensus held that ancient Greeks were simply not capable of producing mechanical devices of that complexity. Stais was essentially told he was wrong by the artifact in front of him. Detailed X-ray analysis, first conducted in the 1970s by physicist Derek de Solla Price, then expanded by the Antikythera Mechanism Research Project using 3D CT scanning in 2005, revealed at least 37 interlocking bronze gear wheels inside a wooden case roughly the size of a shoebox. These gears tracked the Metonic cycle, a 19-year lunar calendar, the Saros cycle, used for eclipse prediction, the movements of all 5 planets visible to the naked eye, the 4-year Olympiad cycle. Inscriptions on the device written in ancient Greek functioned as a user manual. One fragment described the color of upcoming eclipses. Another referenced specific geographic coordinates. Precision measurements of the gears show tolerance is accurate to within a fraction of a degree. No device of comparable mechanical complexity appears anywhere in the archaeological record for the next 1,400 years. The closest analog is a medieval European astronomical clock from the 14th century AD. What sits between them is not a gradual progression of technological development. It is a gap. A flat, empty gap where the intermediate steps should be. Several researchers have proposed that the mechanism was not a unique invention, but a manufactured object, meaning it was part of a production tradition, not a singular moment of genius. If that reading is correct, there were workshops somewhere in the ancient Greek world producing precision astronomical instruments at a level of sophistication we have only recently been able to verify. And whatever produced those workshops is not in the history books. Level 2. The Baghdad Battery. Sometime in the late 1930s, during excavations near the village of Kuyut Rebuha, about 30 kilometers southeast of Baghdad, German archaeologist Wilhelm Koenig unearthed a small clay jar. Inside the jar was a copper cylinder. Inside the copper cylinder was an iron rod. Nig noticed something that everyone since has either found compelling or deeply inconvenient. The assembly was a near-perfect analog for a galvanic cell. A battery. The jar dated to the Parthian period, roughly 250 BC to 224 AD. Fill that clay jar with an acidic liquid, vinegar, grape juice, lemon juice, and the iron-copper assembly generates between 1.5 and 2 volts of electrical current. Researchers at General Electric verified this in laboratory conditions. Willard Gray, a GE engineer, built a replica in 1940 using grape juice and produced a measurable current. This was not a theoretical exercise. The object functions. It generates electricity. The debate is only about whether the people who made it knew that. Nig argued the jars were used in electroplating, applying thin coats of gold or silver to base metal objects. He pointed to gilded objects recovered from the same region whose plating was thin enough to suggest electrochemical rather than fire gilding techniques. Iraqi museum collections included several such objects before the 2003 looting of the National Museum of Iraq, after which they largely disappeared from the accessible record. Mainstream archaeology holds that the Baghdad Battery was likely a storage vessel for sacred scrolls. That explanation accounts for the shape. It does not account for the copper cylinder. It does not account for the iron rod, and it does not explain why both elements are present together, sealed in a configuration that would be extraordinarily specific for an accidental coincidence. 40 similar jars have been found across the same region. All of them share the same internal configuration. That is not an accident of pottery. That is a design. Level 3. The Dendera Light. Carved into the stone walls of the Hathor Temple at Dendera, built during the reign of Ptolemy Shi around 50 BC but on foundations potentially thousands of years older, are a series of bas-relief images that stopped certain engineers cold the moment they saw them. What the carvings show, depending on who is interpreting them, is either a collection of symbolic religious imagery or a functional diagram of an electric light bulb inside an insulating glass envelope connected to a cable. The relief depicts a large, elongated object that tapers at one end. Inside the object, a serpent stretches from base to tip, sinuous, elongated, terminating in a lotus flower at the top. The whole assembly sits on what resembles an insulator. A separate carved element connects from the base. Austrian electrical engineer Walter Garn studied the carvings in detail in the 1990s and produced a scaled replica based on the proportions in the stone. His replica, constructed as a Crookes tube, a vacuum-sealed glass vessel used to study cathode rays, produced a glowing plasma inside when connected to a high-frequency current. The glowing plasma took the form of a serpentine column. In other words, his replica looked exactly like the carving. Egyptian scholars offer a different reading. The serpent represents divine power. The lotus is a standard solar symbol. The entire relief belongs to a coherent cosmological framework well documented in Egyptian religious texts. That framework is real. The symbolism is real. But here is the specific problem. In over 3,000 years of Egyptian visual art, lotus flowers appear thousands of times. Atop columns, inside cartouches, in the hands of gods, in burial chambers. They do not, anywhere else in the record, appear inside an elongated enclosed object resting on an insulating base connected at one end to a cable. Only here, only in this configuration, the Egyptians were extraordinarily consistent visual communicators. An anomaly in their visual grammar is not nothing. What was being depicted at Dendera might be symbolic, but the specific symbols chosen, arranged in that specific geometry, are not replicated anywhere else in 3,000 years of Egyptian art. That absence demands at minimum an explanation. Level 4. The Drop-A-Stones. In 1938, Chinese archaeologist Qipu Te led an expedition into the Bayan Karaula mountain range on the border of what is now Qinghai Province and Tibet. In a system of high-altitude caves, the team found graves. Inside the graves were skeletons, unusually small and fragile, with oversized craniums. Scattered around the burial chambers were 716 stone discs, each approximately 30 centimeters in diameter, with a hole in the center and a double-grooved spiral inscription running from the hole to the outer edge. They looked like stone records. Each groove, examined under magnification, was composed of tiny hieroglyphic characters. 2 decades passed before anyone claimed to have translated them. In 1962, Beijing University professor Tsum Nui announced he had decoded the inscriptions. They described an ancient group called the Dropa, who had crashed in the mountains 12,000 years ago, were stranded and could not return home. His paper was rejected by the Chinese Academy of Sciences. He published it independently. Soviet researchers allegedly studied the discs in the 1960s and found that the stones, analyzed spectroscopically, contained high concentrations of cobalt and other metallic trace elements, inconsistent with local stone sources. One Russian scientist, Dr. Vyacheslav Syzev, reportedly found that the discs vibrated at a specific frequency when electrically charged, as if they had once been a part of an electrical circuit. That finding has never been replicated, because the discs themselves have become essentially inaccessible. The Banpo Museum in Xi'an reportedly displayed some of them. Western researchers who attempted to locate them were repeatedly redirected or told they were in storage. The graves, the discs, the skeletons, all of it sits on a foundation of sources that are either contested, unavailable, or have passed through too many hands to verify cleanly. That is not evidence that the story is false. In archaeology, inaccessibility and contested sourcing are sometimes the result of negligence, bureaucracy, or institutional discomfort. The skeletons, if they existed as described, would answer a very direct question. They have not been available for direct examination by independent researchers. Draw from that what you will. Level 5. The Saqqara Bird, discovered in 1898 during excavations of the Padium tomb at Saqqara, a site already layered with thousands of years of history. A small carved wooden object sat in a display case in the Cairo Museum for more than 70 years before anyone suggested it might be something other than a ceremonial artifact. It was catalogued as Object Number 6347. Sycamore wood, 14 centimeters long, weighing 39.12 grams. Shaped exactly like a bird with a vertical tail fin. No bird has a vertical tail fin. Every bird that has ever existed has a horizontal tail structure. A vertical stabilizer is an aerodynamic feature, the same feature found on every fixed-wing aircraft ever designed by human engineers. Dr. Khalil Messiha, a medical doctor and amateur archaeologist, re-examined the object in 1969 and argued it was not a bird at all. It was a model of a fixed-wing aircraft. The object has a flat-bottomed fuselage, correct for lift. The wingspan relative to body length sits within standard aerodynamic ratios. When aerospace engineer Simon Sanderson and researchers from the University of Liverpool tested a scaled replica in 2006, they found that with a rudimentary engine attached, the replica could achieve sustained flight. Without an engine, it glided, stably, at a lift-to-drag ratio that would be respectable on a modern paper airplane design. Egyptian authorities generally classify the object as a votive bird or children's toy. That classification exists. It is reasonable. Egyptians did carve bird figures, but none of the thousands of other carved Egyptian birds have a vertical stabilizer. None of them share the aerodynamic geometry of the Saqqara object. If this is a toy bird, it is the only toy bird in Egyptian history that also happens to be a functional aerodynamic model. That specificity is the problem. Coincidence explains one anomalous feature. It struggles to explain all of them simultaneously. Level 6. The Piri Reis Map. On October 9, 1929, in the Topkapi Palace Library in Istanbul, a German theologian named Gustav Deissmann was cataloging old materials when he found a piece of gazelle skin parchment, roughly 90 by 63 centimeters, folded and forgotten. Drawn on it was a map. Dated 1513 and signed by Ottoman Admiral Piri Reis, the map showed the western coast of Africa, the eastern coast of South America, and a landmass running along the bottom. Piri Reis noted in margin inscriptions that the map was compiled from 20 older source maps, including ones he attributed to Christopher Columbus. What made American cartographer Arlington Mallory, and later U.S. Air Force Captain Lorenzo Boyle, stop breathing almost literally was the bottom landmass. Mapped in accurate detail featuring bays, inlets, and mountain ranges, it appears to show the coastline of Antarctica, including its subglacial topography. Antarctica was not officially discovered until 1820, and here is the specific technical problem. The map appears to show the coastline as it exists beneath approximately 1.6 kilometers of ice. Topography only confirmed by 20th century seismic surveys, not comprehensively mapped until the 1957 International Geophysical Year. Charles Hapgood, a professor at Keene College in New Hampshire, analyzed the map in the 1960s and concluded it could not have been produced without aerial survey technology or a reference map of extraordinary antiquity. He presented his analysis to the U.S. Air Force. The Strategic Air Command Cartography Office at Westover Air Force Base wrote back confirming that the map's southernmost landmass did appear to show pre-glacial Antarctic coastline at accurate latitudes, and that the cartographic projection used was sophisticated enough that modern analysts had difficulty identifying which projection system Piri Reis had used. Mainstream cartographers argue the southern landmass is likely a speculative addition, a traditional device in Renaissance cartography where mapmakers filled blank southern space with a theoretical continent. That context is real. Renaissance maps frequently included a hypothetical terra australis. But those hypothetical continents are smooth, featureless, based on Ptolemaic balance theory. The idea that a southern landmass must exist to counterweight the northern ones. The Piri Reis southern landmass has detailed topographic features, coastline indentations, mountain ranges in locations where subglacial mountains exist. Speculation does not produce accurate topographic detail of a continent buried under ice. Piri Reis's source maps came from somewhere. Where that somewhere was has never been established. Level 7. The Iron Pillar of Delhi. Stand in the center of the Quad al-Islam Mosque complex in Delhi, and you will see a 7-meter iron column rising from the courtyard, its surface the color of dark bronze, untouched by rust. It has been standing there for approximately 1,600 years. Forged during the reign of Chandragupta II, around 375 to 415 AD, likely moved to its current location sometime in the 10th or 11th century. Delhi receives an average of 714 millimeters of rain annually. Humidity is high. The surrounding iron gates of the same complex have corroded to near ruin. The pillar has not rusted. Metallurgical analysis by Indian Institute of Technology researchers in 2002 identified the mechanism. A thin layer of mesowite, a compound of iron, oxygen, and hydrogen, coats the surface. This layer was not applied externally. It formed naturally as part of the corrosion process, and then it stopped the corrosion process. The mesowite layer is approximately 1/20th of a millimeter thick. It has been self-repairing for 16 centuries. Modern metallurgists have identified it as a passive protective layer, similar in function to the oxide layer that protects aluminum, but far more durable under real atmospheric conditions. The iron itself is wrought iron with an unusually high phosphorus content between 0.10 and 0.28% and an unusually low sulfur content. That specific compositional ratio was not accidental. It was intentional. Replicating that formula today requires knowing exactly which ores to combine, in what ratios, smelted, at what temperatures. Modern steel foundries with full computational support have attempted to reverse engineer this composition and failed to match the pillar's specific corrosion resistance under equivalent atmospheric conditions. The pillar was forged using solid-state hot forging techniques, hammering iron pieces together at high heat without melting them, distributing the phosphorus evenly through the structure. That technique requires temperature control, timing, and material awareness that implies either a long tradition of specialized metallurgical knowledge or a level of empirical experimentation that leaves no trace anywhere else in the contemporary record. The Gupta dynasty produced exquisite art, advanced mathematics, and early astronomical models. What it did not leave behind was any written record of how it solved a metallurgical problem that the 21st century is still studying. Level 8. The Nazca lines. They cannot be fully understood from the ground. Standing among them, you see shallow lines scratched into the surface of the Peruvian desert. Lines that stretch to the horizon, turn at precise angles, and vanish. Remove yourself from the earth by a few hundred meters, and the lines resolve into something else entirely. A condor with a wingspan of 130 meters, a spider 45 meters across, a hummingbird whose beak alone extends 120 meters, geometric figures that maintain consistent width across 12 kilometers of terrain. Etched into the Nazca Plateau between approximately 500 BC and 500 AD by a civilization with no writing system and no evidence of aerial capability, the geoglyphs number more than 800 straight lines, 300 geometric figures, and 70 animal and plant designs. The official explanation is functional. The lines served ritual purposes, possibly related to water, astronomical alignments, or processions connecting sacred sites. Archaeologist Johan Reinhard's fieldwork in the 1980s established compelling connections between the geoglyphs and underground water sources. Astronomer Phyllis Pitluga at the Adler Planetarium identified alignments between certain figures and star positions relevant to the Nazca agricultural calendar. Those explanations account for the purpose. They do not account for the method. Creating a 120-meter hummingbird with consistent proportions across uneven terrain, without any elevated reference point, requires either a precise scaling system, stake and chord geometry transferred from a small master template, or aerial reference. Researchers have demonstrated the stake and chord method works for straight lines. For the animal figures, it requires an original template of extraordinary geometric precision. That template has never been found. But here's what the lines actually demand attention for, and it is not what most people focus on. The surface of the Nazca Plateau is an extremely thin layer of iron oxide-coated pebbles sitting atop pale yellow-gray ground. Removing the surface pebbles exposes the lighter ground beneath. That is how the lines were made. Simple removal. But the plateau's specific atmospheric conditions, near zero wind at ground level, stable temperature, minimal rain, create a natural preservation chamber. The Nazca understood on some level that what they built here would last. They chose this location deliberately. A civilization without writing, without the wheel, without any documented architectural tradition beyond modest adobe construction, chose a location whose specific microclimate would preserve their work for 2.5 millennia, and then produced geometric figures visible only from altitudes they had no documented means of reaching. Some things get built for an audience that hasn't arrived yet. Eight artifacts, 8 different cultures, 8 different centuries, and a single pattern running beneath all of them, which is this. The gap is never in the artifacts themselves. The artifacts work, they function, they hold, they navigate, they generate current, they resist corrosion across 16 centuries of monsoon seasons. The gap is always in the record. There are no intermediate steps, no prototypes, no failed early versions, no workshop notes, no apprenticeship traditions, no evidence of the long experimental process that produces any complex technology in any civilization we fully understand. At the start, I asked what these objects tell us collectively. Here is the honest answer, and it is not the comfortable one. They tell us that our model of ancient technological development, the smooth ascending curve from simple to complex, from primitive to sophisticated, is a model built on incomplete data. Every one of these objects is a data point that sits off the curve. Not slightly off, dramatically off. And when your data points consistently fall in the same direction, that is not noise. That is signal. We have been doing archaeology for roughly 200 years with serious institutional funding. 200 years sounds like a long time. Against a human record that stretches back at least 300,000 years, 200 years of looking is not even a rounding error. We have excavated perhaps 3% of known ancient sites. Perhaps less. The Antikythera wreck sat 60 meters underwater for 2,000 years before a sponge diver happened across it. What is sitting at 70 meters? Every century, we find something that requires us to revise our understanding of what ancient people knew. We revise it, and then very quietly we keep the same underlying assumption, that we were always smarter and they were always less. The Nazca lines are still there, still waiting, still perfectly preserved in their 2,500-year atmospheric vault. And whoever they were built to be seen by has either not arrived or left no record of the visit.